Hi everyone, and welcome to the second of two videos on the Canon F-1. And if my outline ever loads, I'll actually know what I'm about to say next. Alright, here we go. Scrolling, gotta get down to the second video. Here we go. Okay, so as we talked about in the first video, this camera has a ton of features you can use. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the interface. This is some basic use type stuff. The first one is going to be the lens mounting and dismounting. Right now you can see we've got a lens mounted. Okay, so to dismount it, just grab the silver band here, rotate it until the red dot is at the top, and pull it off. Now, some later FD lenses, the silver band doesn't rotate, the whole lens rotates. And you do it the same way, only you're rotating the entire lens, not just the silver band. So that's lens dismounting or unmounting. And then to mount the lens, you simply line up the red dot with the red dot on the camera. You might be able to see it in the middle at the bottom of the prism, and rotate. And it rotates just shy of a quarter turn, and that locks it in place. And it's different from a bayonet system in that this is it's called a breech mount system. So instead of the bayonet's flanges being built into the lens, the flanges are built onto the camera, and then this is a breech, and the breech locks into place, hence breech lock system. Loading the film is pretty simple. It's standard for like any other 35mm camera. You'll push this lock release button right here, then lift up, and the film back pops open. Neither of mine are very springy, and I don't know if that's a problem with my cameras or the way that it's supposed to be, but neither of them are springy. So at any rate, so we're going to take the film. Let's get this lined up a little bit. Whoa! Get this lined up a little bit better. I'm going to take the film, put it over here on this side. I'm going to push this down, and we're going to take up the slack real quickly. There we go. Pull this out. While we're pulling it, I like to actuate the shutter. That way I've got the film in my hand. I know that I'm not going to accidentally let the film get into the shutter and screw things up. Feed it over to the take-up spool. Put it into one of the little socket dealies there, and it's ready to advance. Now shut the back, and I can just advance it 3 frames. And you can tell it's advancing because this spins as you're advancing the film. So this new tripod's really shaky. So you can see it advancing there, indicating that the film is being taken up onto the take-up spool. To take a picture, you just compose it, focus it, set your aperture, set your shutter speed based on the light meter reading, take the picture and go. And to make sure that you don't take a picture when you don't want to, you just lock it like that. To set the shutter speed, you just turn the dial. And many of the prisms, all of the prisms rather, have an indicator. You can see that white dot on the side of my speed finder prism. There we go. One really cool thing about this prism, this is unique to this prism, and I believe also unique to this camera system, this prism itself, is you rotate this 90 degrees and now you've got a waist level finder. And it locks in place at those 2 positions. I guess theoretically you could use it like this, but I will tell you that that is wonky, disorienting, and nigh impossible to do effectively. I tried once just out of curiosity and almost puked because it was just that disorienting. Anyway, so when the film is in the camera, let's open this back up here. When the film's in the camera, take a picture. So I've actuated the shutter, and now I'm going to turn the camera, and you can see over here, when I was talking about in the last video how the film is taken up, in the same direction as the curl, and also so that the emulsion is to the inside, and that way, dang it. Man, I am butterfingers with these Canon F1s. If you've seen my how to change the focusing screen video, I cannot be trusted with nice things. There you go. And you can see that it works differently than most other cameras out there. Like I said, I only have a couple that are like that. And by the way, when I said in the previous video I got these for steal, I really, honestly, I did not. But they were very, very fair, perhaps gracious price. But at any rate, I should have issued that retraction in the first video. So so you can see the film being taken up by the take-up spool. Oh, forgot this other part of the standard portion of this video. To rewind the film, you simply push this button, and it's very important to remember, don't open the film back with film in here. You will ruin it. I'm only opening it up for the purpose of demonstration. Don't do it. Please don't do it. And if you do, please don't send me hate mail. So this is just to demonstrate what happens. So you push this down, and now you can see that the sprocket, you might be able to see it slightly wiggling underneath the registration hole right there every time I release that. What that's doing is that's unlocking the sprocket. So I'm going to rewind the film, and you can see this is what happens when you rewind the film. This is all what happens inside your camera that no one should ever see, because it will ruin your film to see this. I'm going to take that up a little bit more. There we go. Now, in real life, your film door would still be closed, so you push your unlock button, pull that up, and now you can pull your film out. And you should always completely rewind your film when you're done using it. I don't, because I want to use this on my next video. But you should always completely rewind your film, because that way you can't accidentally use it again. And having done that on more occasions than I care to admit, just one, honestly, it's embarrassing. We'll just leave it at that. Anyway, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to change the battery. This camera does not currently have a battery in it. It uses a 1.3 volt mercury battery. You can't get these anymore because mercury is a hazardous substance. Now it's, humans co-evolved with mercury so our bodies can actually get rid of it in less than a month when we ingest it, which is why, tuna and salmon should only be eaten on a monthly basis, because that's how long it takes our bodies to process it and excrete it. It's so much less toxic than things like polybrominated diethyl esters and that synthetic estrogen they use to line pop and beer and food cans with, that seeps into your blood and causes cancer and mutagenic problems for years and years on end, but yet are A-OK because the FDA likes it. Anyway, that's just my environmental scientist work going crazy. I'm not an environmental scientist. And it doesn't matter. I just work with these guys. I wrote reports for the EPA. I've seen crazy stuff and talked about. And so anyway, so they use a mercury battery, which you can't get anymore because America and the rest of the world is so civilized. But you can get a battery that's the same size, that's alkaline, that is a 1.5 volt. And this is how you change the battery. You just open up the battery cover, put the new battery in, and then close it. Now, the problem is that the new batteries are 1.5 volt. And so the light meters don't get the proper amount of voltage to meter properly. So your metering is going to be off. And mercury batteries provided a steady voltage for the entire battery life. Alkaline batteries do not. The voltage changes and drops over the life of the battery, where it might start at 1.5, it might end when the battery dies at about 1.2 or even 1.1 volts. So that means that to use a battery, you can still use the batteries, but it requires some accommodations. So I field tested this over the weekend, and what I'm about to tell you, and I verified that it works because I've already developed the film, and you'll see some of the pictures at the end if you stick around. So here is how you use this camera with a modern battery. The 1.5 volt batteries will cause your meter to underexpose your images. This is backwards from what seems logical to me. It would seem like if there's too much electricity going to it, that it would overexpose, that the meter would go extra crazy. Maybe it's wired backwards. I don't really know how these things work. I'm not an electrical engineer. But all I can tell you is if you put a 1.5 volt in, your camera's going to underexpose by 2 stops. Now what that means is it's the difference between 400 ISO and 100 ISO. That's a 2-stop difference. It's the difference between 100 ISO and 25 ISO, or 400 ISO and 1600 ISO. Each one of those is a 2-stop stage. So what you have to do is compensate for that. So if you put 400 ISO film in your F1, you set the ISO dial to 100 and it will meter properly. If you put 100 ISO in, you set it to 25 and it will meter properly. If you put 25 ISO in your camera, you're out of luck because it doesn't go 2 stops slower than that. 50 would be difficult to use, I think. So here's how you verify that. There's this thing called the Sunny 16 rule, which you might be aware of, which is if you have a subject you're taking a picture of and it's in full sun, then at f16 the proper shutter speed is the reciprocal of the film ISO value. So you've got 400 speed film in your camera. You're taking a picture of something in full sun. At f16 the shutter speed is 1/400th. If you just use a standard battery and set this to 400 ISO, it's going to take a shutter. It's going to tell you to do a 1/1000th of a second for your shutter speed, or thereabouts, maybe 1/2000th even. So what I did was I knew that it had to be f16 1/400th. So I put 400 speed film in, set it to f16. Set this to 1/500th, which is as close as it comes to 400. And then I adjusted the ISO dial. Then I adjusted the ISO. This camera does not actually like to adjust the ISO. So I adjusted this until the meter lined up properly at my aperture and shutter speed settings to give me the correct exposure. And actually, in fairness, what I really did was I first tried it with 250 ISO film, and then I also tried it because 250 was, I fortunately have a whole ton of 250 ISO Vision 3 Kodak sitting around. Kodak Vision 250D, it's a 5207 is the catalog number. Amazing, amazing film, definitely worth it, and a little bit less expensive in bulk than standard color film. At any rate, so it exposes at 250 ISO, so I put a roll of that in. And then I tested the settings to get this to the correct the correct ISO to expose for the Sunny 16 roll. And then once I verified that the battery was in fact giving me a 2-stop underexposure, I tried it with 100 ISO, 180 ISO, and actually the 180 ISO is Kodak 5222, the XX film, which is also a motion picture film. Beautiful film, by the way. Really amazing film quality. And also some 400 ISO FOMA pan. And what I found was that the 2-stop compensation worked beautifully for each of those ISOs. I intentionally brought 4 different ISOs so I could test it on various things. So, once again, sorry about that. So once again, here's how you compensate for having too strong a battery in here. You go outside when it's sunny. You find an ISO. You find a shutter speed close to your ISO. So if you have 100 ISO film, you set it to 1/125th. You set your aperture to f16, and then you go through the meter and you change your ISO setting until you get to an ISO that lines the meter up properly. Now, what do I mean lines the meter up properly? What I'm going to do, what we'll do in a minute, I have to see where it is on the outline. I hate going out of order on the outline. we'll look through the camera viewfinder and we'll see what the meter looks like. Oh, this camera uses a PX625 battery, and that's what I was using in it this past weekend when I tested it to have it work just fine. Oh, also, because the battery's voltage changes over its lifetime because it's an alkaline, this camera cannot compensate for that. Periodically, when you use the camera, let's say every dozen or 2 dozen rolls, I don't even know exactly how long these batteries last in this camera, just check to make sure that the Sunny 16 rule is still applicable, because after a while it'll only be one stop off, and then it'll be accurate, and then it'll be overexposing by a stop, and then maybe even overexposing by 2 stops shortly before it dies. So you'll need to periodically verify the Sunny 16 reading in order to ensure that you're still getting proper compensation, changing the ISO for what you're doing. Effectively, what you're doing is you're using an old-time trick to do exposure compensation, where if you've seen cameras that have a +1, +2 dial on them, that's exactly what you're doing here with this. So that's how you used to be able to do +1, +2 exposure compensation on these old-time cameras, is with the ISO dial instead of with a separate dial. At any rate, so there's also wine cell batteries available for 1.3 volt, but they die very, very quickly, which just means a lot of batteries going off to the landfill. Hopefully not, or preferably to recycling. And and they're also a lot more expensive than the standard 1.5 volts. So in my opinion, I will continue to use the 1.5 volts and just compensate for it. So we've got over here we've got the flash hot shoe. The hot shoe, I believe, is an FP hot shoe, maybe also X. I can't. No, it's an electronic hot shoe. I was incorrect about that. And then you've got an electronic port right here. And the flash sync speed is 1/60th of a second. Oh no, this does have an FP hot shoe on it. So the shoe is either FP or electronic. With electronic flashes, you sync at 1/60th of a second, which is why the 60th is yellow on the dial here. With FP, you can sync at any speed, including 1/2000th. The reason for that is because electronic flashes flash instantaneously. Boom, bright, done, just like that. The FP flashes and other types of bulb flashes flash longer. So the flash lights up. The whole shutter mechanism, I just bumped the camera again, I'm really sorry. The whole shutter mechanism thing opens, and then after it's done, then the flash dims again. So it's a longer burn time on the flash, which means you can use a faster shutter speed, because let's say that this whole frame is the shutter, okay? With a fast shutter speed, you only get a slight opening for 1/1000th of a second, or 1/2000th. With 1/60th, what happens is the first shutter opens and then the second shutter opens. So when the first shutter is open like that, the entire negative is open to the light. That's when the electronic flash goes off, and then the second curtain shuts. So if you do it at 1/125th, electronic flash goes off. And so this part of your image would be dark, or vice versa, something like that. That's just to illustrate the concept. But with FP flashes, flash starts, stays on, stays on, stays on. So for the whole time you're doing the 1/500th or 1/1000th of a second exposure, flash goes off. So that's the difference in the way they work. Metering. Oh, okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go grab my macro lens and put it on the camera, and we're going to take a look, and we're going to look through the speed finder, and we're going to look through the standard prism, and we're going to see how they look different and the types of things you see in the viewfinder. Okay, here we go. Here's the viewfinder. So you can see over on the right, that's your meter needle. And so it's actually a 2-needle system. Oh, I keep focusing the wrong thing. I'm trying to focus. I need to focus this. There we go. So it's actually a 2-needle system. So you can see that it's got that little circle there. And then there's also a needle that's hidden off the top or bottom right now, that when you adjust the shutter speed and aperture, the needle will move. The aperture adjusts the circle, I believe. Let's find out. Yeah, the aperture adjusts the circle. And then the shutter speed adjusts the needle, but since I don't have a battery in it, it won't show. Now, you can see it's a pretty bright viewfinder. I'm sorry, pretty bright meter space, but if I put my finger over the meter window, it blocks out the light. So it's actually a really nice advantage to have that meter window, because it allows very bright meter information. You can see it also displays the shutter speed underneath the meter there. The red areas are for if you're too fast or too slow. And then also, there we go. It suddenly turns red. You can see as I turn it, there's a red piece of plastic that covers it, that slides into place at 1/4 of a second. And so that tells you are definitely not hand holding this thing. Is what that means. Okay. Now also, you can see there, you can see it there we go. There's the lens I've been filming this whole thing with. That's my Pentax FA Limited. Anyway, now you can see that through there's a little grid. And that grid is the focusing screen that I've put in it. So it helps with compensation to have that grid, because you can line up horizontal and vertical lines, which is good for architectural photography, photographing the horizon, photographing for reproduction and reprographic type things as well. So the grid is a pretty nice type of focusing screen to have. Also, while we have the speed finder out, going to rotate it. Try to find my focus again. There we go. And there you can see my awesome off-camera setup. That's the end of the white backdrop, a couple rolls of tape, which I don't know why they're sitting up there, a binder clip, and an electrical cord that's going to one of my fancy studio lights that costs $7. So basically what I've done by rotating the pentaprism is given myself a waist level finder. Wrong way. And this new tripod is really shaky. I think it's going to be only for outdoor work from now on. I'll tell you, my new tripod, I bought myself a Manfrotto 055B with a pan tilt head on it, and I'm kind of surprised that it's this shaky, because I'm definitely not bumping it any harder than I used to bump my Vivitar that cost substantially less, and that didn't shake that much. At any rate, so here is the other one, and this has the standard prism screen in it. You can see coming into focus the two chips that are in the eyepiece glass, and if you saw my video about changing the eyepieces, you know how that happened. I'm trying to get well, all you can see there is a lot of dirt on the focusing screen. But you can see, importantly, that it looks different than the other one, come on. It looks different than the grid screen. I'm having trouble getting this one to focus today. Anyway, so that's what it looks like. The important thing was seeing the meter, the way that the meter looks in the viewfinder, and what happens when you cover the lens or cover the light port or uncover the light port when you're using it. All right, hopefully this will be better. I have braced my tripod legs differently for the remainder of this video. So, where was I? I completely lost my space in this outline again. Oh, this is such great. This is YouTube at its finest right here, folks. This is absolutely the best video you're going to see this week. Okay. Anyway, so some unique camera features. You can take double exposures with this camera, and this is completely not unique. This is absolutely in the wrong part of this outline. You take double exposures with this camera in the same way you do with any camera that doesn't have a double exposure button, which is you take your first photo, you hold down the film release. This will keep the film from advancing. So you hold it down, you advance the crank. Now, even though you've advanced the crank, that's just to reset the shutter cocking mechanism. Because you're holding the film release, it's not actually advancing the film. There we go. Then you take your second image. Don't advance it yet, or you can if you only want to take a double image, you're done. Or if you want to take a triple image, you hold it the film release button on the bottom again. Now you take your third image. You can do that ad infinitum. You can do that 1,000 times if you want to, but really 2-3 exposures is about the most you can really get on an image with it before it starts to look too chaotic. Then once you're done with your picture, you advance the frame. Now put your lens cap back on, because the registration will be slightly different now, because it takes part of this advance before the film sprocket. Okay, so before I was so rudely interrupted by my camera's battery going from full green to dead in 5 seconds. What I was saying was, after you take your final image, you want to put your lens cap back on, and then you want to take a dummy image, a dead frame. And the reason for that is because in taking multiple exposures, because you're holding down the film release, when you start taking the pictures again, what happens is it changes the registration, changes the way that the film lines up. And so it takes part of this advance for the film to start advancing again onto the spool. So if you don't take a dead image with the lens cap on between your multiple exposure shot and your next frame, then what happens is you risk having your next frame partially overlap your multiple exposure shot. And with the amount of time and effort and planning that go into a good multiple exposure shot, it's a tragedy to ruin them that way. I know, I've done it. I have done everything you can do wrong with photos, trust me. At any rate, we've said multiple times this has an amazing number of add-ons. I think that, just had to reset the microphone placement. I hope that didn't make too much noise. Amazing number of add-ons. I think that there were 120, I think there were 120 something add-ons, or might have been more, in the entire system. So that said, there probably are very few people on the planet who own the entire F1 system, if any. So at any rate, there are tons and tons of things. You could do anything photographic you wanted with this system. Other things, you can do stop-down metering with FL lenses. And the way that you do that is FL lenses don't communicate the aperture setting from the lens to the cameras. And what that means is you can see that they have these levers here. So this lever is what controls your aperture, and you can't see anything when the lens isn't on the camera. This is what transmits the aperture information to the camera. So this lever is not present on FL mount lenses. And so in order to properly meter an FL lens, what you've got to do is what's called stop-down metering. And that means you set your shutter on your your aperture on your FL lens, and then you stop it down that way with your depth of field preview lever. And in fact, you can also lock that in place. And this helps you this is exactly what this is for, locking the depth of field preview in place. Because with the depth of field preview locked, you can now fine-tune your exposure. Once that's done, you release it, and then you take your picture. the FL lenses still have this control, so they will still stop down properly when the exposure is taken. Come on, come on, you know you want to mount back on the camera. This video has been fraught with technical difficulties. So the light meter window over here, this is a unique feature as well. As we've seen, allows a bright meter in many conditions. Since flashlights are very small and cell phones have lights on them, if you're using one of these in a dark place and you need to double check your meter reading, you can just pull out your cell phone, have the screen on with a white screen and hold it up there, and you'll have enough light to see the meter, and you won't disturb everything going on around you. The meter turns red when it's too slow to be handheld. Stop down metering you get by we just talked about that. It's out of order. Stop down can be locked. Okay, showed you how to do the MLU in the previous, and that's mirror lockup in the previous video. But we'll take another look at that here. So mirror lockup is performed this way. You go to your lock, you stop down, and then you go on to M. And that performs your mirror lockup. It also locks your aperture in place. And what this does is when you take your picture, you get no camera shake, none whatsoever. Because there's no camera shake from the aperture being shut down. There's no camera shake from the mirror locking, flapping up. And so if you need to take very precise, very focused pictures, that's the way to do it. And that's really good for astrophotography, where the slightest amount of shake can show in a star trail, or if you're doing barn door tracking, this is extremely good for barn door tracking, because it will, this feature will allow you to have no camera shake as you're setting up the picture and getting ready to take it, and will also, so that way you don't introduce camera shake at the beginning when you're trying to capture an in-focus and bright picture of a constellation, let's say. Also, it's really good for long duration shots. Same thing with like star trails. Let's say you wanted to take a nighttime photograph of a bridge and the lights on it. You could do this, lock up your mirror, with it on a tripod, obviously. Start your exposure, come back 30 seconds, 10 minutes, however long later, and the image will be very crisp because it won't have had the initial kick from the mirror going up. MLU self-timer. The self-timer is controlled by the stop-down lever. We looked at that a little bit in the first video. And the rear cover, I showed you how to take that off in the first video. I'll show you that again really quickly. And that's, I actually didn't really describe it in the first video, so I'll show you how to do the rear cover removal now. But the rear cover can be removed so that the 250 exposure back can be put onto it, onto the camera. So with the back open, there is a little tiny, over on this side, you're probably not going to be able to see it, but there's a little silver area in the hinge right here. That silver area has a pin. So you push the pin towards the bottom of the camera, and then the back just comes right off. To put the back on again, you put it in the bottom of the camera that you put into where the hinge rests. Push the pin down and then slide it into place and let the pin go. And that's how you take the back off and how you would replace it with the with a 250 exposure back. This camera, even though it's a professional level camera, is 40 years old. And so it's going to have some limitations by modern standards. At the time, these weren't considered limitations in the same way that we would consider them limitations today. Now, one of them is that older cameras have older metering technology, and they can't fully meter the full range of available light in some conditions. Now, the worst part about this is that it changes based on the film speed. And if you're using a 1.5 volt battery, because you have to change the ISO setting, this range is also very screwed up. Now, in practical application, I've actually never had a problem with this, and I've run, in the last 6 weeks, I've run about 8 or 10 rolls of film through it with all kinds of different settings and different film speeds and lenses and apertures and lighting conditions, and this hasn't actually come into play yet. But it's worth mentioning in case you want to know what's happening with your camera when it doesn't respond like you expect it to. So, at 100 ISO, the F1 can meter accurately from f1.4 to f11 in a range at 1/4 of a second to 1/500th of a second. At f16, it can meter at 1/1000th, and I'm sorry, I have a typo in here. That is bad. So let's start this over. The F1 can meter at 100 ISO. The F1 can meter from f1.4 to f22, which is basically the full range. I think there's an f1.2 lens, but I'm not positive about that for the FD mount. But about the fastest most lenses go is the f1.4. So at 100 ISO can meter from that to f22 from 1/4 of a second to 1/500th of a second. At f16, it can meter up to as fast as 1/1000th, and at f11, it can meter at 1/2000th. So at 100 ISO, if you set it to f22, it will not give you a meter reading for 1/2000th or 1/1000th of a second. If you set it to f16, it will not give you a meter reading for 1/2000th of a second. And it will give you the full range of meter readings from f1.4 to f11, regardless of your shutter speed, at 100 ISO. At 200 ISO, the f1 can meter from 1.4 to f22 from 1/8 of a second to 1/1000th of a second. So it can, at that point, in the full range, at 200 ISO, it can no longer meter properly at 1/4, 1/2, and 1 full second in the f1.4 to f22 range at 200 ISO. At f16, it can, from f1.4 to f16, it can meter at 1/2000th of a second. At 400 ISO, the f1 can meter from f1.4 to f22 from 1/15th of a second up to 1/2000th of a second. Below that, then, it doesn't meter properly. So those are some limitations. Now that said, if you're using if you're using 400 ISO film and you're taking a picture slower than 1/8 of a second, you're probably doing something wrong. Because it's a fast film, it's not supposed to be used for that. And likewise, if you're using 100 ISO film set at f22, the likelihood of you needing a 1/2000th of a second exposure is pretty slim. You'd basically have to be taking pictures of spotlights pointing at the sun. So, so the limitations exist, but they are not something which will come into play in 99.999% of situations. In fact, if every one of my cameras had those limitations, I can think of no time in my life when they would have impaired my ability to take a photo, because those limitations fall so far outside the range of normal photo taking, it's just not an issue. So anyway, this wraps up my second video of 2, introducing the Canon F1. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the comments below, and I'll respond to them. I'm pretty good about responding fairly quickly. If this video was helpful, please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know I'm on the right track, and that the content I'm producing is useful to you guys. Also, if you subscribe, you'll get a chance to see more of my videos when they come out, and you'll be notified of them if you'd like. And one last thing, thank you for watching.